Fort Vancouver is located on the coast of the Columbia River in the city of Vancouver, Washington. And today, there are a number of historical and beautiful sights that any age can enjoy. Fort Vancouver became a national monument in 1948, and later a national park reserve in 1968. Today, the fort is ran by the National Park Service and offers a variety of educational tours of the fort's reconstruction. The fort has several replica buildings, such as the blacksmith shop, the woodworking shop, the jail, the bakery, and the bastion. Educational tours are also available, as well as an audio tour. A visitor center is available for anyone who wishes to learn about the fort and its history. In the early 1800s in the Willamette Valley, there was opportunity to be made. Trade in the area had been slowly building ever since early settlers and entrepreneurs had discovered the area. Lewis and Clark had discovered the Northwest Passage, and the area was about to change.
When the Lewis and Clark expedition had come down the Columbia River, they had realized that this was the river that was going to offer the access into the interior, and so suddenly all the fur companies realized that this was, the key to access and resupply on the West Coast, and so Columbia became very much the center of intention and focus for these fur trading companies.
In the 1800s, the fur trade was booming, and one company in particular, the Hudson Bay Company, had taken notice of the area. Fort Vancouver was to be established as the headquarters of the Columbia District of the Hudson Bay Company, an area that covers most of the Northwest. In 1821, the Hudson Bay Company had set up temporary operations in the area with plans of a major trading post soon after.
And then in 1821, the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company were merged, and they became the new Hudson Bay Company, and all the operations and much of the personnel that had been part of the Northwest Company now became part of the Hudson Bay Company. And one of the first orders of business, after deciding that they were actually going to set up an operation here on the West Coast, was to build a new depot, a new headquarters that would offer a distribution point and a collection point for their anticipated string of trading posts that they were going to be building out here. And so that's what Fort Vancouver became.
Fort Vancouver was established with one goal in mind: to harvest the fruits of the land.
And so in 1824, they moved upriver and began initially constructing a temporary trading post about a mile east of us here. And then 3 years later, late in the year of 1828, they began constructing a more permanent post down here on the river plain. And the final expansion of that is what we see in the reconstruction today.
Most of the early travelers who came to Fort Vancouver were contracted employees of the Hudson Bay Company. They came from many different places with many different trades.
The people settling here in the early part of the Hudson Bay operation were mainly, of course, connected with Hudson Bay. They were the workers that were going to be working in the fort operations here. They were farmers, there were carpenters, blacksmiths, shipbuilders, fishermen, livestock people, all the various trades and businesses that were going to be run by the company out here.
The York Factory Express was the major trade route known to the fort. It started in the east, coming from the York Factory itself on the Hudson's Bay in eastern Canada. It ran west to several trading posts throughout Canada until turning south along the area's various rivers that led into the Northwest Territory.
York Factory was the other end of the trail. The trail was basically a series of canoe rides, though. It was canoeing up the Columbia River to the headwaters of the Columbia to what's now Jasper National Park, and then hiking over the Rocky Mountains to Edmonton, and then down the Saskatchewan River to York Factory, which was a post similar to this, a little larger than this, on the southwestern shore of Hudson's Bay.
The Indians of the area were friendly towards the inhabitants of the fort. They supplied much of the area's fur trade.
Well, the Hudson Bay Company relations with its main trading partners, who were, of course, the American Indians in the area here at Fort Vancouver, generally were considered pretty cordial. Afterwards, these were really the people who supplied the trade to the company, and the company was certainly dependent on them for their trade. And so they really went to the farthest extreme to keep good relations with these people that they traded with.
The fort was set up with various different kinds of trade. There was a blacksmith, a woodworking shop, a bakery, a fur warehouse, and various other trade buildings. Many of the tools and items of the time were created at the fort itself. The fort had several cannons and a small militia for defense, but none of these were ever used in anger.
The fort was never built as a defensive position. The term fort was simply a term that the Hudson Bay used as basically a group of buildings enclosed by a palisade.
The large cannons that you see out in front, they were never operable. They were what are called spiked cannons, which means the touch hole where the powder is lit off was filled in. They couldn't have lit those cannons off if they had to.
There was one man in charge, Dr. John McLaughlin, the fort's chief factor, and was later known as the Father of Oregon.
Dr. McLaughlin was probably one of the most misunderstood people in the whole region. He wasn't trusted by very many people. The Americans didn't trust him because they thought he was overcharging them for the goods that they were buying from him.
Fort Vancouver was to become known as the end of the Oregon Trail, and many travelers would begin their lives in the Pacific Northwest.
Particularly the early years, the fort was what I think we could really seriously consider the end of the Oregon Trail, because in particularly those early years when the guidebooks had not been written, the best places to ford the rivers had not been discovered and written about, and word had gotten back to the people in the east. Those first few years, people were coming out here. They didn't know what to bring. They didn't know how much to bring. They didn't know what to leave behind. And if they brought too much, they ended up throwing out a lot of it along the way. If they brought too little, they ended up starving on the way out here.
But the time period that we're portraying here today is 1845. So in 1845, there's a lot of people coming down the Oregon Trail. This fort was the end of the Oregon Trail that time, so there were a lot of settlers that were coming in, especially in October and November. That was when most of the people arrived at the end of the trail, with virtually nothing to their, carrying at virtually nothing, and needing a place to get supplies.
In the late 1800s, the Hudson Bay Company was making plans to move its Columbia District headquarters. Fort Vancouver was soon to become an American territory.
And it wasn't until 1849 that the first United States Army troops arrived here in May of 1849. At that time, the United States was not really interested in what the Hudson Bay Company was doing. They were, their operations were moving off land, and they were much more intent on protecting the immigrants coming out on the Oregon Trail. And so that was really what the first American troops were out here to do, was to protect those American citizens that were arriving into the territory and along the Oregon Trail.
The fort would continue on under the United States Army until the beginning of World War II. In 1948, Congress declared Fort Vancouver a national monument. And later, in 1968, it would become a national park reserve. The fort today is a place of learning and education about our history in the Northwest, about our roots in the Willamette Valley. And thanks to the National Park Service, Fort Vancouver will be enjoyable, educational, and available for future generations to come.